I walked onto the stage in full dress uniform, sat at the grand piano and placed my fingers on the keys for the first time in 8 years. Within 30 seconds, Admiral Rebecca Torres, the Navy's most decorated band commander, had tears streaming down her face. But what happened next would silence my sister forever and prove that some dreams don't die, they just wait for the right moment to rise. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, and for 25 years, I've carried two identities that my family believed could never coexist: a decorated naval officer and a pianist who once dreamed of Carnegie Hall. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same hands that could dismantle enemy cyber networks with surgical precision were the same hands that once caressed ivory keys with the gentleness of a prayer. That December evening at the Naval Academy's annual Memorial Gala started like any other military ceremony I'd attended in my career. The Bancroft Hall ballroom was transformed into something that belonged more in a palace than a military academy. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in navy blue and gold, where 500 of the most distinguished officers and dignitaries in the Atlantic Fleet sat in their dress uniforms, medals catching the light like stars against dark fabric. I was there as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, cybersecurity specialist, recently commended for my work in preventing a major digital infiltration of our communications network. The citation had been read aloud just 2 hours earlier. For exceptional service in the protection of classified naval communication systems, demonstrating technical expertise and innovative problem-solving that prevented potential compromise of operational security. Standard language for extraordinary work that most people would never understand or appreciate. But music? Music was my failed past, according to my sister Victoria, who never missed a chance to remind me that I'd given up on piano to play soldier. Her words from our last conversation 3 months ago still echoed in my mind with the persistence of a bad song you can't shake. Sarah, you had talent once, but you threw it all away for some misguided sense of patriotism. Now you're just another person in uniform who used to be special. Victoria had always been the golden child, first chair violin in the Philadelphia Symphony at 22, married to a successful conductor, living in a penthouse overlooking Rittenhouse Square. She measured success in concert reviews and standing ovations, in the reverent silence that follows a perfect performance. To her, my military career was a consolation prize, a backup plan for someone who couldn't make it in the real world of classical music. What she didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I'd never stopped playing, not completely. In the quiet hours between night shifts monitoring network security, in the privacy of the base chapel when everyone else was asleep, I'd find an old upright piano and let my fingers remember. These weren't performances. They were conversations with a part of myself I'd been forced to hide, moments of communion with the music that lived in my bones. The evening's atmosphere was both celebratory and solemn. This was the Academy's most sacred event, a memorial service disguised as a gala, where we honored the sailors and Marines who'd given their lives in service over the past year. The memorial wall dominated one side of the ballroom, dozens of photographs of young men and women who would never come home, never attend another gala, never feel the satisfaction of a mission completed. I knew some of those faces personally. Petty Officer Marcus Chen, killed in a training accident off the coast of Virginia. Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Walsh, lost when her aircraft went down in the Mediterranean. Each photograph represented not just a life cut short, but families destroyed, potential unrealized, dreams that would forever remain unfulfilled. The program was precise, as military ceremonies always are. Admiral George Patterson's opening remarks about sacrifice and service, the presentation of posthumous awards to families, the reading of names, each one followed by the striking of the ship's bell, a sound that seemed to echo not just through the ballroom but through time itself. And then, the centerpiece of the evening, a piano performance of Amazing Grace, followed by taps, to be played during the moment of silence for the fallen. It was tradition, sacred and inviolable. The music served as a bridge between the world of the living and the memory of the dead, a way to honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. That's when everything began to unravel. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, the Academy's music director and the evening's planned pianist, had been fighting a bout of severe bronchitis all week. She'd insisted she could perform, Musicians, like military personnel, have a deep aversion to letting their team down, but as the evening progressed, her condition worsened. I watched from my table as she grew paler, her breathing more labored. 20 minutes before her scheduled performance, Dr. Hoffman approached Admiral Rebecca Torres, the Navy's most decorated band commander and the evening's master of ceremonies. Even from across the room, I could see the conversation was serious. Dr. Hoffman's hands moved expressively as she spoke, Admiral Torres's face growing more concerned with each word. Admiral Torres was a legend in military musical circles. She'd conducted the Navy Band at presidential inaugurations, state funerals, and diplomatic events around the world. She'd taken the Navy's musical program from good to extraordinary during her 15-year tenure. Her reputation for excellence was matched only by her reputation for not tolerating anything less than perfection. The conversation ended with Dr. Hoffman placing a trembling hand on the Admiral's shoulder, shaking her head apologetically before making her way toward the exit, clearly too ill to continue. Admiral Torres stood alone for a moment, scanning the room with the calculating gaze of a military strategist facing an unexpected tactical challenge. The ceremony's centerpiece, the musical memorial that hundreds of families and dignitaries had come to experience, was about to be canceled. In military tradition, there are few things more sacred than honoring the dead with proper ceremony. To have that ceremony diminished because of a missing pianist would be unthinkable. That's when Commander James Walsh, my former Academy roommate's husband and current Director of Academy Personnel, noticed Admiral Torres' distress. James had been at the Academy when I was a midshipman, had heard me play during the informal gatherings in the dormitory common areas, where stressed midshipmen would sometimes gather around the old upright piano for moments of musical therapy. I watched as James approached Admiral Torres, leaning in close to speak privately. His eyes moved across the room until they found me, and I felt a chill of recognition. I knew what he was about to say before the words left his mouth, could see the suggestion forming in the way he gestured in my direction. Admiral Torres followed his gaze, her sharp eyes settling on me with the intensity of a targeting system. She studied me for a long moment, as if trying to reconcile the cybersecurity specialist she knew with the musician James was apparently describing. Her face showed no emotion, but I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, weighing risk against necessity, reputation against duty. Then she began walking toward me. The approach felt like it took forever, though it couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. Every step she took seemed to echo through the ballroom, though I knew that was impossible over the conversation and gentle background music. My fellow officers at my table, Commander Patricia Wells, Lieutenant David Chang, and Captain Robert Martinez, all noticed the Admiral's approach and gradually fell silent, understanding instinctively that something significant was about to happen. Admiral Torres moved with the bearing that had made her famous throughout the Navy, confident, purposeful, but never arrogant. She'd earned respect through decades of service, not through intimidation. When she wanted something, she asked directly. When she gave an order, it was followed without question. When she made a request, it was understood to be the kind of request that wasn't really a request at all. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said as she reached our table, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard clearly even in crowded rooms. "Might I have a word?" The formal phrasing was pure military courtesy, but I could hear the underlying urgency. I stood immediately, as protocol demanded, and followed her a few steps away from the table, close enough to the memorial wall that I could see the faces of the fallen clearly. "Lieutenant, Commander Walsh informs me that you have extensive musical background," she said without preamble, her voice low enough that our conversation remained private. "Classical piano training specifically." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I felt the weight of 500 people in the room, the expectation of families who'd come to honor their lost loved ones, the sacred nature of the ceremony that was now in jeopardy. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. 20 years of classical training. Graduated from the Juilliard School before receiving my commission. Admiral Torres's eyebrows rose slightly. Juilliard wasn't just any music school. It was the music school, the institution that produced the world's finest classical musicians. The fact that someone had walked away from Juilliard to join the Navy was unusual enough to be noteworthy. "When did you last perform?" she asked, the question carrying multiple layers of meaning. She wasn't just asking about the mechanics of playing piano, she was asking about performing under pressure, about the ability to deliver when it mattered most. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of honesty. 8 years, ma'am. Not in public. The admission felt like a confession. 8 years was a lifetime in musical terms. Technique could deteriorate. Confidence could evaporate. The muscle memory that separated professionals from amateurs could fade. In 8 years, fingers could forget their way around keys that had once been as familiar as breathing. But Admiral Torres didn't flinch at the number. Instead, she studied my face with the same intensity she probably used to evaluate personnel files or strategic plans. She was reading something in my expression, looking for signs of competence, confidence, or fear. "Dr. Hoffman has taken ill," she said, stating what I'd already deduced. "We need someone to perform Amazing Grace and taps for the memorial portion of the ceremony. These families have traveled across the country to be here tonight. Some of them are experiencing their first military memorial service for their lost children." The weight of that statement settled over me like a physical presence. This wasn't about music in the abstract, about artistic expression, or personal fulfillment. This was about sacred duty, about honoring the dead and comforting the living, about maintaining the dignity of a ceremony that meant everything to families whose worlds had been shattered by loss. "The pieces themselves are not technically complex," Admiral Torres continued, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone explaining a mission briefing. "But the emotional weight, the significance, these families are counting on us to honor their loved ones appropriately." I looked past her toward the memorial wall, letting my eyes focus on the photographs of the fallen. Petty Officer Chen's smile seemed to jump out at me. He'd been barely 21 when his ship went down, younger than I was when I first walked away from concert halls to serve my country. Lieutenant Commander Walsh's official portrait showed the kind of determined expression that spoke of someone who'd never backed down from a challenge. "Ma'am," I said, my voice finding strength I didn't know I possessed, "I understand the significance. If you believe I can serve appropriately, I'm willing to try." Admiral Torres nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that indicated the decision had been made. "You'll have approximately 10 minutes to familiarize yourself with the instrument and prepare. The Steinway is concert quality, but every piano has its own personality. Can you work with that timeline?" 10 minutes. In the world of classical music, performers typically spent hours preparing for important performances, fine-tuning their interpretation, adjusting to the specific instrument, managing pre-performance anxiety. 10 minutes was barely enough time to run through the pieces once, let alone achieve the kind of perfection that military ceremonies demanded. But this wasn't the concert world. This was the military, where you adapted to changing circumstances, where you performed under pressure, where the mission came first regardless of personal comfort or ideal conditions. "Yes, ma'am, 10 minutes is sufficient." "Very well. Report to the stage area in 5 minutes. I'll announce the change to the program." She paused, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Lieutenant, these pieces, they're not about technical perfection. They're about honoring memory and providing comfort. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember why we're here." As Admiral Torres walked away to make the necessary announcements, I stood alone beside the memorial wall, feeling the weight of what I'd just committed to do. The faces in the photographs seemed to be watching me, waiting to see if I could honor their sacrifice appropriately. My hands, which had been steady all evening, began to tremble slightly, not from fear of the music itself. Amazing Grace and taps were pieces I could play in my sleep, melodies that were woven into the fabric of American military tradition. The trembling came from something deeper, the knowledge that I was about to step back into a world I'd left behind, about to reconnect with a part of myself that I'd buried so deep I sometimes forgot it existed. For 8 years, I'd been Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, cybersecurity specialist, the woman who could navigate digital battlefields with precision and calm. But tonight, I would have to become someone else, someone I used to be, someone my family had convinced me I could no longer be. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same sister who'd called me a failure was probably at that very moment preparing for another concert with the Philadelphia Symphony, never knowing that her failed pianist sister was about to play for an audience that included some of the most distinguished military leaders in the country. As I made my way toward the stage area, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the ballroom's large mirrors. The woman looking back at me wore lieutenant's bars and service ribbons, the external markers of a successful military career. But underneath that uniform, underneath the professional competence and military bearing, was a pianist who'd never really stopped being a pianist. She'd just learned to be very, very quiet. The next few minutes would determine whether that pianist still existed, whether 8 years of silence had preserved or destroyed what 20 years of training had built. As I approached the Steinway grand piano that dominated the stage area, gleaming under the ballroom lights like a promise waiting to be fulfilled, I realized that I was about to find out not just whether I could still play, but whether I could still be the person music had once made me. The silence in the ballroom was beginning to shift as Admiral Torres approached the podium to announce the change in program. 500 pairs of eyes would soon be focused on me, waiting to see if I could provide the musical bridge between their grief and their hope, between memory and healing. I placed my hands on the piano keys for the first time in 8 years, and everything changed. The first note that escaped from the Steinway grand piano wasn't just a sound, it was a declaration of war against 8 years of silence. As the pure crystalline tone of middle C filled the Naval Academy ballroom, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like tectonic plates that had been locked in place suddenly finding freedom to move. But what happened in the seconds that followed would reveal just how deep my family's betrayal ran, and how many people had conspired to convince me that my musical dreams were not just impossible, but selfish. Admiral Torres had given me 10 minutes to prepare, but as I sat at the piano bench, adjusting the height and testing the pedals, I realized that no amount of time could have prepared me for what I was about to discover about myself and the forces that had shaped my life for the past 8 years. The Steinway was magnificent. A Model D concert grand that had probably cost more than most people's houses. The action was perfectly balanced, each key responding to touch with the sensitivity of a thoroughbred horse responding to an expert rider. The tone was warm and rich, with the kind of depth that only comes from instruments crafted by masters who understand that music is not just sound, but emotion given form. As I ran through a few scales to familiarize myself with the instrument, muscle memory began to assert itself with shocking clarity. My fingers found their positions automatically, the years of training embedded so deeply in my nervous system that 8 years of neglect couldn't erase them. It was like discovering that a language you thought you'd forgotten was still fluent on your tongue. But with that rediscovery came a flood of memories I'd spent 8 years trying to suppress. And with those memories came the realization of just how systematically my family had undermined my musical ambitions. The first memory that surfaced was from my senior year at Juilliard. I was 21, preparing for my senior recital, the performance that would determine whether I graduated with distinction and opened doors to the kind of career that musicians spent their entire lives dreaming about. I'd been working on Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex pieces in the classical repertoire. My parents had driven up from Philadelphia to attend the recital. My father, Dr. Richard Mitchell, was a respected cardiac surgeon who measured success in lives saved and medical breakthroughs. My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, was a federal judge who dealt in evidence and precedent, in clear-cut decisions based on facts and law. Neither of them had ever quite understood why their daughter had chosen to pursue something as ephemeral and unpredictable as classical music. But it was my sister Victoria who delivered the crushing blow that would reshape my understanding of my own worth. Victoria was already established with the Philadelphia Symphony at that point, having secured her position through what everyone assumed was pure talent and dedication. She was 5 years older than me, and had always been held up as the example of what musical success looked like. When she attended my senior recital, I thought she was coming to support me, to celebrate what I hoped would be the beginning of my own professional career. Instead, she came to deliver a message that would haunt me for years. After my performance, which I thought had gone reasonably well, despite a few technical passages that hadn't been quite as clean as I'd hoped, Victoria found me backstage. The recital hall was still buzzing with post-performance energy, faculty members and fellow students offering congratulations and critiques in the way that classical musicians do, analyzing every phrase and dynamic choice with the intensity of scholars debating philosophy. "Sarah," Victoria said, pulling me aside into an empty practice room, "we need to talk." I was still riding the adrenaline high that comes after a major performance, still processing the emotional journey I'd just taken the audience through. Rachmaninoff was like that. It demanded everything from the performer, requiring not just technical precision, but deep emotional vulnerability. I felt drained and exhilarated simultaneously. "That was adequate," Victoria began, her tone carrying the kind of clinical detachment that I'd learned to associate with her professional demeanor. "But Sarah, you need to understand something about this business. Adequate isn't enough. It's not even close to enough." The words hit me like a physical blow. Adequate. After 4 years of intense training, after pouring my heart and soul into that performance, my own sister, someone whose opinion I valued more than almost anyone else's, was telling me I was merely adequate. "The music world is incredibly competitive," she continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to deliver difficult news. "There are thousands of pianists out there, with your level of technical skill, with your musical understanding, but only a handful who have what it really takes to make it professionally." I felt something cold settling in my stomach. "What are you saying, Victoria?" "I'm saying that you should consider other options. You're smart, Sarah. You're analytical, disciplined, focused. Those are qualities that would serve you well in fields where success is more predictable, where hard work actually translates into advancement." She paused, studying my face as if gauging how much truth I could handle at once. "Medicine, like Dad. Law, like Mom. Even something like engineering or computer science. Fields where there's a clear path to success, where talent and hard work are rewarded in concrete ways." I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. This was my sister, the person who'd encouraged me to pursue music in the first place, who'd helped me prepare for my Juilliard auditions, who'd celebrated when I was accepted. "But this is what I love," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. "This is what I've always wanted to do." Victoria's expression softened slightly, but her words remained firm. "Love isn't enough, Sarah. I love music too, but I also understand the realities of this profession. Do you know how many talented musicians are waiting tables, teaching private lessons to uninterested children, or playing wedding gigs just to pay rent? Do you know how many brilliant performers never get the opportunities they deserve because they don't have the right connections, the right look, the right marketing approach?" She gestured around the practice room with its worn piano and water-stained ceiling. "This is the dream, Sarah, right here." Practice rooms and student recitals and the constant anxiety of auditions that may or may not lead anywhere. Is this really the life you want? I felt tears beginning to form, though I tried to hold them back. Victoria had always been my role model, the person whose success I aspired to match. If she was telling me I didn't have what it took, maybe she was right. "Look," she said, her voice taking on a more gentle tone, "I'm not saying you should stop playing entirely. Music can be a wonderful hobby, a way to enrich your life and the lives of others, but as a career. Sarah, I just don't want to see you struggle for years trying to achieve something that might not be realistic." That conversation changed everything. Within 6 months, I'd withdrawn from my graduate program applications and had begun exploring other options. The military had appealed to me because it offered the kind of structure and clear advancement path that Victoria had insisted was necessary for a fulfilling career. The Navy's cybersecurity program was expanding rapidly, and my computer science minor made me an attractive candidate. But now, 8 years later, sitting at this magnificent Steinway in front of 500 distinguished guests, I was beginning to understand that Victoria's advice hadn't been sisterly concern. It had been something much more calculated. As I continued to warm up, testing different passages and reacquainting myself with the feel of a world-class instrument, fragments of other conversations began to surface. Phone calls where Victoria had subtly undermined my confidence. Family gatherings where she'd made pointed comments about the practical choice I'd made in joining the military. Comments from our parents that seemed supportive on the surface but carried undertones that suggested they'd always expected me to fail at music. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was making me sick to my stomach. During my final year at Juilliard, I'd been invited to audition for several prestigious summer programs, the kind of opportunities that could launch a career. The Tanglewood Music Center, the Aspen Music Festival, the International Keyboard Institute. These weren't casual invitations. They were the result of faculty recommendations based on exceptional performance. But somehow, every one of those opportunities had been sabotaged. The Tanglewood application had been submitted late, apparently due to a postal error that Victoria had offered to help me resolve. The Aspen audition materials had been sent to the wrong address, again, with Victoria volunteering to help coordinate the logistics. The International Keyboard Institute had never received my audition recording, despite Victoria's assurance that she'd personally delivered it to the mail service. At the time, I'd been devastated, but had attributed these failures to bad luck, to the universe's way of telling me that maybe professional music wasn't meant to be my path. Victoria had been there to comfort me, to reinforce the idea that these setbacks were signs I should consider other options. But now, with the clarity that comes from distance and experience, I could see the deliberate pattern. Victoria hadn't been protecting me from disappointment. She'd been creating it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My own sister, the person I'd trusted most in the world, had systematically sabotaged my musical career to eliminate me as competition. Because that's what it had been about, I suddenly understood. Competition. Victoria's position with the Philadelphia Symphony hadn't been secured purely through talent, as I'd always believed. She'd been sleeping with the conductor, Marcus Steinberg, for 3 years before she was hired. The affair was an open secret within the orchestra, but had been carefully hidden from the public and from our family. I knew this because Commander Walsh's wife, Janet, was a violinist with a different symphony who'd shared the gossip during a casual conversation at a Navy spouse event 2 years earlier. At the time, I dismissed it as typical musician drama, the kind of rumor that followed every orchestra. But now I understood its significance. Victoria had built her career on relationships and manipulation, not just musical excellence. And she'd recognized that my talent posed a threat to the carefully constructed narrative of her success. The evidence was all there, waiting to be assembled like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too naive to solve at 21. Victoria had helped me prepare for my Juilliard auditions, offering to review my repertoire and provide feedback. But her suggestions had been subtle sabotage, recommending pieces that didn't showcase my strengths, encouraging interpretations that were technically correct but emotionally flat, insisting that certain passages required approaches that made them more difficult than necessary. She'd supported my decision to pursue graduate studies, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about the viability of a musical career. Every conversation had been carefully designed to erode my confidence while appearing to be loving concern. And when those methods weren't enough, she'd moved to more direct sabotage, ensuring that applications were lost, audition materials were misdirected, and opportunities disappeared before I could even compete for them. The pattern extended beyond just my musical career. Victoria had been undermining me in other ways for years, subtle enough that I'd never recognized it as deliberate. When I'd expressed interest in studying abroad during college, Victoria had convinced our parents that it would be too expensive and potentially dangerous. When I'd been invited to participate in master classes with renowned pianists, she'd found reasons why the timing wasn't right, or the teachers weren't worth the investment. Every time an opportunity had presented itself that might have elevated my musical career, Victoria had been there with reasons why it wasn't the right choice, wasn't the right time, wasn't worth the risk. But the most insidious part of her manipulation had been the way she'd convinced our entire family to participate in it. Our parents, who'd never fully understood or supported my musical ambitions anyway, had been easy targets for Victoria's campaign. She'd framed her sabotage as protection, convincing them that she was saving me from the heartbreak and financial instability that came with pursuing a career in classical music. Sarah's very talented, she'd told them, but she's also sensitive. The music world would destroy someone like her. It's better that she finds something more stable, something that will give her security and respect. Our parents had bought into this narrative completely. They'd seen Victoria's apparent success with the Philadelphia Symphony as evidence that she understood the music world in ways that I didn't. When she suggested that I consider other career paths, they'd supported her advice as the wisdom of someone who'd navigated the treacherous waters of professional music successfully. Even our extended family had been recruited into this effort. Aunts and uncles who'd once praised my playing began asking pointed questions about my backup plans. Cousins who'd attended my recitals started making comments about the practicality of military service compared to the uncertainty of musical careers. The entire Mitchell family narrative had been rewritten to position Victoria as the musical success story, and me as the sister who'd been smart enough to pursue something more realistic. But the most devastating realization was that this pattern of manipulation had continued even after I'd left music behind. During my years in the Navy, whenever I'd mentioned missing music or feeling nostalgic about my piano training, Victoria had been quick to reinforce the idea that I'd made the right choice in leaving that world behind. "You're so much happier now," she'd tell me during our occasional phone calls. "You have security, respect, a clear career path. You're not constantly stressed about auditions and competitions and whether you're good enough." She'd made sure to share stories about struggling musicians she knew, about talented performers who'd never quite made it, about the physical and emotional toll that professional music took on even successful artists. "Music is so much more enjoyable when it's not your livelihood," she'd say. "You can play for pure pleasure now without all the pressure and politics." But she'd also made sure that I had very few opportunities to play even for pleasure. Family gatherings never included pianos anymore. Victoria had convinced our parents that having an instrument around would be painful for me, a reminder of what I'd given up. Quote, "When I'd mentioned finding piano teachers or joining community orchestras near my various duty stations, Victoria had subtly discouraged these pursuits. Military life was demanding enough, she'd argue. Did I really want to add the stress of trying to maintain performance standards in my spare time? The manipulation had been so complete, so thorough, that I'd internalized it completely. I genuinely believed that my decision to leave music had been my own choice, based on realistic assessment of my abilities and prospects. I'd convinced myself that the occasional pangs of musical longing I felt were just nostalgia, not genuine loss. But now, as my fingers moved across the Steinway's keys with a fluidity that 8 years of neglect shouldn't have allowed, I understood the truth. I hadn't lost my musical ability. I hadn't outgrown my passion for performance. I hadn't made a mature decision to pursue a more practical career. I'd been systematically destroyed by someone who was supposed to love and support me, someone who'd recognized my talent as a threat to her own carefully constructed success. The realization was making me physically ill, but it was also igniting something I hadn't felt in years: anger. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns bright and fast, but the cold, calculating anger that comes from understanding exactly how you've been wronged and by whom. The kind of anger that doesn't seek immediate revenge, but patient justice. As I ran through the opening measures of Amazing Grace, feeling the melody flow from my fingers with an ease that proved Victoria's assessment of my abilities had been lies, I began to understand that tonight wasn't just about honoring fallen sailors. Tonight was about reclaiming everything that had been stolen from me. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here I was, about to perform for one of the most distinguished military audiences in the country, in front of admirals and generals and dignitaries who represented the career path Victoria had convinced me was more worthy than music. But I was performing as a musician. Despite 8 years of suppression, despite systematic sabotage, despite being convinced that I wasn't good enough to succeed in the music world, I was still fundamentally a pianist. The Navy hadn't made me a pianist, Juilliard hadn't made me a pianist, 20 years of training hadn't made me a pianist. I had always been a pianist. That identity was so fundamental to who I was that no amount of manipulation or discouragement or time could erase it. As I prepared to begin the actual performance, I caught sight of Admiral Torres in my peripheral vision. She was watching me with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was evaluating not just my musical preparation, but my mental state, my confidence, my readiness to deliver under pressure. What she couldn't know was that I was discovering something about myself that changed everything I thought I understood about my own identity and capabilities. The woman who'd walked onto this stage 10 minutes ago had been Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, cybersecurity specialist, someone who'd chosen practicality over passion and had convinced herself she was content with that choice. But the woman sitting at this piano bench was someone else entirely, someone who'd been buried alive for 8 years but had somehow survived the experience. Someone who was about to announce her resurrection in the most public way possible. I looked out at the audience. 500 distinguished guests who'd come to honor the fallen, families who'd traveled across the country to participate in this memorial service, military leaders who represented the highest levels of American defense establishment. They had no idea they were about to witness not just a musical performance, but a revolution. In 30 seconds, when I played the first note of Amazing Grace, I wouldn't just be honoring the memory of fallen sailors. I'd be declaring war on 8 years of lies, on the systematic destruction of my dreams, on the family members who'd convinced me I wasn't good enough to pursue the life I'd actually wanted. Victoria had spent 8 years building a wall between me and my musical identity, but walls I'd learned in the military could be breached if you knew where to apply pressure. And I was about to apply all the pressure I'd been storing up for 8 years of suppressed dreams and manipulated choices and accepted limitations that had never actually been real. The first note was going to be more than music. It was going to be proof. The first note of Amazing Grace emerged from the Steinway grand piano with a purity that seemed to suspend time itself. But what happened in the minutes that followed would shatter 8 years of lies and prove that some truths are too powerful to remain buried forever. As my fingers found their way through the opening phrase, something extraordinary began to happen in that Naval Academy ballroom. The note didn't just fill the space, it transformed it. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The gentle clinking of glasses ceased. Even the subtle background sounds of a large gathering, shifting chairs, rustling programs, whispered comments, fell away into absolute silence. But it wasn't just the silence that was remarkable. It was the quality of attention that settled over the room like a living thing. 500 distinguished guests, including some of the most powerful figures in American military leadership, found themselves completely absorbed by music emerging from someone they'd known only as a cybersecurity specialist. I could feel their attention like a physical presence, but more importantly, I could feel something awakening inside myself that had been dormant for 8 years. This wasn't just muscle memory or technical training reasserting itself. This was the return of an identity I'd been convinced no longer existed. The melody of Amazing Grace flowed from my fingers with an ease that defied logic. 8 years without serious practice should have meant hesitation, missed notes, technical struggles. Instead, I found myself playing with a fluidity and emotional depth that I wasn't sure I'd ever achieved before. But as I moved through the familiar phrases, I became aware that something unprecedented was happening in the audience. From my position at the piano, I could see the front rows clearly, and what I saw was transforming my understanding of what music could accomplish. Admiral Rebecca Torres, the Navy's most decorated band commander, was crying. Not the polite tears that sometimes accompany moving performances, but deep, silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere profound and unexpected. Her shoulders shook slightly with each breath, and she'd given up any attempt to maintain the composed demeanor that military protocol demanded. But she wasn't alone. As I continued playing, I could see tears on faces throughout the front rows. Hardened military officers who'd commanded troops in combat zones, who'd made life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure, were being moved to tears by a piece of music they'd probably heard hundreds of times before. What they were experiencing wasn't just the familiar emotional impact of Amazing Grace. They were witnessing something rarer and more powerful, the moment when suppressed truth finally finds its voice. The realization hit me as I transitioned into the second verse. They weren't just hearing music. They were hearing 8 years of silenced dreams, suppressed passion, and denied identity finally breaking free. They were witnessing the resurrection of something that had been declared dead. As the final notes of Amazing Grace faded into silence, the ballroom remained absolutely still for what felt like an eternity. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, pregnant with emotion and recognition and something approaching awe. Then Admiral Torres stood. In military ceremonies, there are protocols for when audiences rise, specific moments when standing is expected or required. This wasn't one of those moments. Admiral Torres stood because she was compelled to stand, because the music she'd just heard demanded acknowledgement that went beyond polite applause. And as she stood, something remarkable happened. One by one, without any signal or coordination, the entire audience rose with her. 500 people coming to their feet not because protocol demanded it, but because they just witnessed something extraordinary. The applause, when it finally came, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the enthusiastic but brief acknowledgement that typically follows military ceremony performances. It was sustained, building in intensity, filled with an emotional depth that spoke to something profound. But as I sat at the piano bench, acknowledging the standing ovation with the gracious nods that years of performance training had ingrained in me, I became aware of something that made my heart race with anticipation. In the back of the ballroom, near the entrance, I could see a familiar figure. Victoria. My sister stood in the doorway, still in her Philadelphia Symphony concert attire, the elegant black dress and pearls that were her professional uniform. She must have driven down from Philadelphia immediately after her own performance, arriving just in time to witness mine. Her face was a mask of emotions I'd never seen from her before: shock, recognition, and something that looked remarkably like fear. But I wasn't finished. Admiral Torres had requested Amazing Grace, followed by Taps, and the second piece would be even more meaningful and more challenging than the first. Taps is deceptively simple in its construction, just 24 notes that form one of the most recognizable and emotionally powerful melodies in American military tradition. But simplicity in music, like simplicity in life, can be the most difficult thing to achieve perfectly. Every note in Taps matters. Every pause, every dynamic choice, every subtle variation in timing contributes to the piece's ability to honor the dead while comforting the living. It's a melody that's been played at military funerals for over 150 years, a bridge between grief and peace, between loss and acceptance. As I prepared to begin, I looked out at the memorial wall with its photographs of the fallen, but now I was seeing those faces differently. They weren't just images of sailors and Marines who died in service to their country. They were reminders of dreams that had been cut short, of potential that would never be realized, of all the music that would never be played because the musicians were gone. But they were also reminders of something else: the importance of honoring truth while we still can, of refusing to let others define the limits of our potential, of fighting for the right to become who we're meant to be. I began Taps with a single note that seemed to carry the weight of all the sorrow and all the pride that fills military memorial services. But as I continued, something began to happen that transformed the piece from a funeral dirge into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. I found myself playing not just for the fallen sailors, whose photographs watched from the memorial wall, but for all the dreams that had been declared dead prematurely. For all the talents that had been buried by people who'd claimed to have our best interests at heart. For all the voices that had been silenced by those who feared what they might say. The melody of Taps became a dialogue between grief and defiance, between acceptance and revolution. Each note was simultaneously an acknowledgement of loss and a declaration that some things, truth, talent, authentic identity, cannot be destroyed no matter how systematically they're attacked. As I approached the final phrase of Taps, I became aware that the emotional atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted again. The tears I could see on faces throughout the audience weren't just for the fallen servicemen we were honoring. They were for recognition of something universal: the tragedy of suppressed potential and the miracle of its unexpected resurrection. When the final note faded into silence, the ballroom remained still for even longer than it had after Amazing Grace. This silence was different, deeper, more contemplative, charged with the understanding that something significant had just occurred. Admiral Torres was the first to break the silence, but not with applause. Instead, she spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics despite the fact that she wasn't using a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice thick with emotion but strong with conviction, "we have just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a musical performance, but a reminder of why we serve, why we sacrifice, and why we must never allow true talent to be wasted or suppressed. She paused, looking directly at me with an expression that conveyed both admiration and understanding. Lieutenant Mitchell, in 25 years of military service and musical leadership, I have never heard taps performed with such profound understanding of its meaning. You have honored our fallen comrades in a way that will remain with everyone in this room for the rest of their lives. The applause that followed was even more sustained than before, but Admiral Torres raised her hand to indicate she wasn't finished speaking. But I suspect, she continued, that tonight's performance represents more than just musical excellence. I suspect we've witnessed the return of an artist who belongs not just in military service, but on the world's greatest concert stages. The implication of her words hit the ballroom like a physical force. Admiral Torres wasn't just praising a good performance. She was making a professional assessment, using her authority as one of the military's most respected musical leaders to declare that what we'd all just heard was world-class artistry. As the applause finally began to fade, I stood from the piano bench and made my way to the front of the stage. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for during 8 years of suppressed dreams and manipulated choices. I looked out at the audience, my eyes moving from the distinguished military leaders in the front rows to the families who'd come to honor their fallen loved ones. And then my gaze found Victoria, still standing in the back of the ballroom, her face now clearly showing the fear I'd glimpsed earlier. "Thank you," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. "It has been an honor to perform for this distinguished gathering and to help honor the memory of our fallen servicemen and women." I paused, taking a breath that felt like preparation for the most important words I'd ever spoken. But I must share something with you that makes tonight's performance particularly meaningful for me personally. 8 years ago, I walked away from music because I was told, by people I trusted, that I wasn't good enough to succeed professionally. I was convinced that my talent was merely adequate, that the music world was too competitive for someone with my abilities, that I should pursue something more practical and secure. A murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't the kind of personal revelation typically shared at formal military ceremonies. I believed those assessments because they came from family members who claimed to have my best interests at heart. I believed them because I trusted that people who loved me would tell me the truth about my abilities and my prospects. I could see Admiral Torres leaning forward slightly, her expression showing growing understanding of where this was heading. But tonight, as I sat at this magnificent instrument and felt music flowing through me with an ease that 8 years of neglect should have made impossible, I realized something important. I was never inadequate. My talent was never merely sufficient. My dreams were never unrealistic. The ballroom was absolutely silent now, every person focused completely on what I was saying. I was systematically sabotaged by someone who recognized my abilities as a threat to their own career. Applications were lost. Audition materials were misdirected. Opportunities were eliminated before I could even compete for them. And throughout this sabotage, I was being convinced that the failures were evidence of my own limitations. I looked directly at Victoria, who had gone pale but hadn't moved from her position near the entrance. Tonight's performance proves that talent doesn't disappear just because someone convinces you it was never real in the first place. Tonight proves that 8 years of silence couldn't destroy what 20 years of training had built. Tonight proves that some truths are too powerful to remain buried forever. The audience was completely transfixed. What had begun as a memorial ceremony had transformed into something unprecedented, a public declaration of artistic resurrection. "Victoria," I said, addressing my sister directly across the ballroom, "I know you're here. I know you drove down from Philadelphia after your own performance tonight. I know you came to see whether the sister you convinced was a failure could actually perform at this level." Victoria's face showed something approaching panic, but she remained frozen in place. "What you've discovered tonight is that your assessment of my abilities was never based on reality, it was based on fear. Fear that if I succeeded in music, it would expose the ways you built your own career. Fear that if I achieved recognition for my talent, it would raise questions about how you achieved recognition for yours." I paused, letting the implications of my words settle over the audience. "But here's what you didn't understand, Victoria. Success isn't a zero-sum game. My achievements don't diminish yours. My talent doesn't threaten yours. There's room in the music world for both of us. There always was. Admiral Torres stood up again, her movement drawing everyone's attention. Lieutenant Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone making an official pronouncement. Based on what I've witnessed tonight, I'm formally inviting you to audition for the position of principal pianist with the Navy Band. It's a position that would allow you to maintain your military career while pursuing musical excellence at the highest level. The offer hit the ballroom like a bombshell. The Navy Band was one of the most prestigious musical ensembles in the country, performing for state dinners, diplomatic events, and the most important ceremonies in American government. But Admiral Torres wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, I'm recommending that you be considered for the Navy's Advanced Musical Education Program, which would allow you to pursue graduate studies in performance while maintaining your commission. The Navy needs officers who can represent our service in cultural and diplomatic contexts. And your performance tonight demonstrates that you possess exactly the kind of artistic excellence we're looking for. The audience erupted in applause, but I was focused on Victoria's reaction. She looked as if she'd been physically struck, her face showing the realization that not only had her sabotage failed, but that I was being offered opportunities that exceeded anything she'd achieved in her own career. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. As the applause died down, an elderly woman in the front row stood up. I recognized her immediately. Mrs. Janet Chen, the mother of Petty Officer Marcus Chen, one of the fallen sailors we'd honored tonight. Young lady, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom despite her age. I don't understand all the family dynamics you've just described, but I understand something else. My son Marcus loved music. He played guitar and always talked about the power of music to heal people, to bring them together, to help them through difficult times. She paused, tears evident in her voice, but her words strong and clear. What you've given us tonight, the way you honored my son and all the others we've lost, that's the kind of gift that shouldn't be wasted. That's the kind of talent that should be shared with the world, not hidden away because someone else was afraid of competition. She looked directly at Victoria, who was now openly crying. And anyone who would try to destroy that kind of gift, even family, needs to understand that they're not just hurting one person. They're depriving the world of something beautiful and healing and necessary. The impact of Mrs. Chen's words was devastating in their simple truth. This wasn't about family drama or career competition anymore. This was about the responsibility that comes with genuine talent and the tragedy of allowing that talent to be suppressed. As Mrs. Chen sat down, Victoria finally moved. But instead of approaching the stage or trying to defend herself, she turned and left the ballroom. Her exit was quiet, almost furtive, the departure of someone who knew they'd been exposed and had no defense to offer. Admiral Torres approached the stage, her expression showing both professional admiration and personal warmth. Lieutenant Mitchell, she said, I meant every word of those offers, but more than that, I want you to understand something important. What happened here tonight wasn't just about music. It was about the resurrection of truth, the triumph of authentic talent over artificial limitations, and the reminder that it's never too late to reclaim what's rightfully yours. She paused, smiling with genuine warmth. The Navy Band rehearses every Tuesday and Thursday at 1,900 hours. I'll expect you there next week to begin preparing for our spring concert series. And I'll have the advanced musical education paperwork on your desk by Monday morning. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself surrounded by people wanting to express their appreciation for the performance and their support for my musical future. But the conversation that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Commander Patricia Wells, who'd been sitting at my table earlier in the evening, approached as I was finally preparing to leave. Sarah, she said, I need to tell you something. I knew Victoria in college, before either of you were famous in your respective fields, and I knew even then that she was capable of the kind of manipulation you described tonight. I looked at her with surprise. Patricia had never mentioned knowing Victoria before. I should have said something years ago when you first mentioned your sister was a symphony musician, but I didn't want to interfere in family relationships, and I wasn't sure my impressions were accurate. She paused, looking uncomfortable but determined to continue. But after tonight, after seeing your talent and understanding what was done to suppress it, I need you to know that you weren't imagining things. Victoria was always someone who saw other people's success as a threat to her own. What she did to you wasn't unprecedented. It was pattern behavior. The validation was both comforting and deeply sad. It confirmed my growing understanding of Victoria's actions, while also making me realize how many people had recognized her character flaws but had chosen not to intervene. But here's the important thing, Patricia continued. What happened tonight proves that talent like yours can't be permanently suppressed. It proves that 8 years of silence couldn't destroy what was fundamentally true about who you are. As I finally left the Naval Academy that night, driving through the quiet streets of Annapolis toward my apartment, I tried to process everything that had changed in the space of a few hours. I'd walked into that ballroom as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, cybersecurity specialist, someone who'd convinced herself that she'd made a mature decision to leave music behind for a more practical career. I was leaving as someone fundamentally different, an artist who'd been suppressed but never destroyed, a musician whose talent had been confirmed at the highest levels, a woman who finally understood the difference between genuine limitations and artificial ones imposed by others. But perhaps most importantly, I was leaving as someone who'd learned that truth has its own power, independent of the people who try to suppress it. Victoria had spent 8 years building an elaborate structure of lies, designed to convince me that my musical dreams were unrealistic. But all it had taken was one performance, one moment of authentic expression, to bring that entire structure crashing down. My phone buzzed with a text message as I pulled into my apartment complex. It was from Admiral Torres. Sarah, I've been thinking about tonight's performance. I want you to know that what you accomplished wasn't just personally transformative. It was professionally significant. I'm recommending you for the Navy's Cultural Ambassador Program, which would involve performing at embassies and diplomatic events around the world. Your talent deserves the largest possible stage. I sat in my car for a long moment, reading and rereading the message. Cultural Ambassador, diplomatic performances. The largest possible stage. These were opportunities that exceeded anything I dreamed about during my years at Juilliard. These were the kind of positions that combined musical excellence with meaningful service, that allowed for artistic achievement within the context of something larger and more important. Victoria had convinced me that leaving music was a practical choice, a mature recognition of limited opportunities in the classical world. But what I discovered tonight was that the opportunities had always been there. I'd just been looking in the wrong places. The military, which Victoria had positioned as the antithesis of artistic achievement, was actually offering me a platform for musical expression that most classical performers never access. The Navy wasn't asking me to choose between service and art. They were asking me to combine them in ways that could make both more meaningful. As I finally made my way upstairs to my apartment, I realized that the woman who'd been convinced she was a failed pianist had just been offered the chance to become something unprecedented. A successful musician whose performances would serve diplomatic and cultural purposes that extended far beyond personal achievement. Victoria had been right about one thing. The music world was highly competitive and offered limited opportunities for traditional career paths. But she'd been wrong about everything else. She'd failed to understand that talent finds its own way, that authenticity creates its own opportunities, and that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most meaningful destinations. I fell asleep that night thinking about Mrs. Chen's words about the responsibility that comes with genuine talent. For 8 years, I'd allowed that talent to be suppressed because I'd believed lies about its value and its potential. But truth, I'd learned, has remarkable resilience. It can survive years of suppression, systematic sabotage, and even the betrayal of those closest to us. And when truth finally finds its voice again, as it had tonight in the Naval Academy ballroom, it doesn't just heal the wounds inflicted by lies, it transforms them into something more powerful than they ever could have been without the struggle. The failed pianist was dead. The woman who'd taken her place was just beginning to understand what she was capable of achieving. The end. Final message. Asterisk, asterisk. Sometimes the people who try to limit us do us the greatest favor of all. They force us to discover strengths we never knew we possessed. Victoria thought she was destroying my musical career, but she was actually preparing me for something bigger than either of us had imagined. The chance to serve my country through the very talent she'd tried to suppress. If this story resonated with you, Remember that your authentic self can survive any amount of suppression. Truth doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to rise again. 2. Tarps, like this video if you believe talent deserves recognition, regardless of who tries to suppress it. Comment below. Have you ever had someone try to convince you that your dreams were unrealistic? Subscribe for more stories about overcoming family betrayal and reclaiming your authentic self.